Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Market Monocle. This is episode 3, and we'll be talking about cannabis politics, which I've noticed don't get a lot of coverage, but as I'm sure you know, this is super important for investors. In the episode, we'll be comparing the three major cannabis bills, what the chances of them passing are, and going through the real catalyst for the sector, i.e., those that actually move share prices. For those returning to the channel, I apologize, this is yet another episode on cannabis. I promise that I do have non-cannabis episodes in the pipeline. I'm usually not a fan talking about politics, but if you're like me looking for stocks that earn multiple times your initial capital, for cannabis, it really only is politics that is standing in the way. Now, you probably already know this. The fact is that the vast majority of Americans support legalization of cannabis. As if we need another confirmation, the Pew Research Center 2 weeks ago found that 60% of Americans believe there should be full legalization of weed, while over 90% would like some form of legalization. That's either medical or recreational. Now, currently 18 states plus DC and Guam made it legal to buy and consume recreational marijuana, while 38 states plus DC have approved medical marijuana only. Now, for those not in the US or unaware, the issue here is that while many states have made it legal, there is still a major conflict with federal laws, which still deem marijuana illegal. Specifically, marijuana is illegal today because of a law 50 years ago, classifying marijuana as a Schedule 1 drug under the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Prevention and Control Act, also known as the Controlled Substances Act. Basically, marijuana is classified in the same group as LSD, heroin, ecstasy. It is just absurd that this has not changed in 50 years. So what's really the consequence of this mismatch between federal and state's law? Well, there are three big things. The first is that there's a section in the US tax code, specifically the section 280E, that forbids businesses from deducting expenses from their gross profit when it involves dealing with a Schedule 1 or a Schedule 2 controlled substance. In essence, what it means is that companies are kind of like paying taxes on gross profit instead of operating profits, which deducts things like general and admin expenses, marketing expenses, and other overhead. In effect, this raises the tax rate for cannabis companies, which can be as high as 70%. It goes without saying a tax rate of 70% would make it impossible to be profitable. The second major consequence of marijuana still being federally illegal is that financial institutions don't want to work with cannabis or cannabis-related companies because of a risk of being prosecuted or losing their banking license. In reality, what this means is that everything must be done in cash, and this cash cannot be deposited into banks. They have no payment or transfer functions available to them, so they can't deal with suppliers efficiently. They also have no access to insurance, or even if they do, the premiums are extraordinarily high. They also don't have traditional bank loans available to them. And in essence, the cost of capital for the company is much higher. And what this means to investors is that if cost of capital is higher, this lowers the valuation of the company as it increases the discount rate. And the third consequence is just like the second, but for other non-financial institutions. Basically, no one wants to work with cannabis or cannabis-related companies because of a risk of being prosecuted. This includes logistics, ancillary suppliers, and even stock exchanges. And in general, what this does is that it makes it much harder for these businesses to grow, and it makes them much less efficient. Like they can't get into major retailers, or they can't use USPS for logistics. And as a whole, it lowers the growth of the industry and also lowers the growth of these companies. So what is being done to solve this issue? Well, there are three main bills in the pipeline that might change things. I'm going to go through each one and tell you exactly what they do, starting from the most comprehensive one, which is known as MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. This is as close as the holy grail as we can get, and this is the one which will send the stocks highest if it were to pass. The biggest thing that the bill does is that it deschedules marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act, effectively allowing cannabis companies to kind of be like normal companies, meaning access to banking, doing business across state lines, and even lists on major stock exchanges. Importantly, with marijuana descheduled, it would allow companies to deduct operating expenses under Section 280E of the tax code, and this would dramatically reduce effective tax rates and allow for a path for sustainable profit growth and value creation to shareholders. Now keep in mind that this does not mean that there won't be excise tax on cannabis companies. The MORE Act does propose a 5% national tax used to fund social justice programs on the sale of all cannabis products for the first 2 years, with successive 1% increases until an 8% tax is reached. Though this is incremental, cannabis companies can definitely live with this. So what's the status of the MORE Act now? Well, the bill was actually passed in December 2020 with a vote of 228 to 164, although it was mostly symbolic at the time as it was already nearing the end of the 2-year term of the 116th Congress. The bill was passed largely along party lines, with only 5 Republicans and the lone independent member joining Democrats to pass the bill. At the end, 6 Democrats voted no. What the House needs to do now is to reintroduce and pass the bill again in the current Congress, which in my opinion should be a relatively easy task. But as I'll explain later on in more detail, this bill is doomed to fail in the current Senate, and hence I don't expect much in the near term. The second cannabis bill in the pipeline is the STATES Act, which stands for Strengthening the 10th Amendment Through Entrusting States Act. It was first introduced in Congress in 2018, and the most important thing to note is that it is less comprehensive than the MORE Act, as it does not deschedule cannabis. However, it still directly addresses the core issue of federal and state level conflict by amending the Controlled Substances Act. Basically, the States Act say that as long as you're abiding by state's law, you're no longer in violation of federal law. Even though it's less ambitious than the MORE Act, I think it's a good enough workaround, as operationally, it would feel very much like a full legalization, as even if you deschedule cannabis, individual states do have the ultimate say whether cannabis can be used recreationally or medically. Perhaps the biggest plus of the States Act is that it would likely give companies access to the capital markets, as NASDAQ and NYSE would be willing to work with cannabis companies again. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, this is really the biggest catalyst for the sector. So what's the status now? Well, it's kind of in limbo, and it hasn't gone anywhere significant as it's never been voted on in either chambers. However, note that the bill has 65 co-sponsors, 20 of which are Republican representatives, representing the biggest support by the Republican Party of the 3 major bills I talk about in this episode. Even though I personally think that the STATES Act is the most realistic bill to send cannabis stocks rocketing, unfortunately, Democrats have shifted attention to the MORE Act, as one, they've become more ambitious after the winning control of the 2 chambers, and 2, the MORE Act has something that the STATES Act don't, and that's social justice provisions. And this is something that a lot of Democrats care about. The last bill is what I call the Better Than Nothing Act, which is the Safe Banking Act. And this bill was passed in the House last week in a bipartisan 321 to 101 vote. However, US cannabis stocks still fell by an average of around 3% on the day. Why? Well, because this is the 4th time it has actually passed the House, once in 2019 as a standalone bill, and twice in 2020 as part of the COVID-19 relief packages. What this means is that this is not new news, and it is expected that it was going to pass. Of the 3 bills I talk about in this episode, the Safe Banking Act is clearly the weakest of the 3, as it does not solve any of the industry's 2 biggest problems, the 280E and access to capital markets. All it does is really make it clear that financial institutions would not get penalized if they decide to work with cannabis companies. Of course, this is ultimately a good thing for the industry, but it would not necessarily move share prices all that much, since it doesn't really change forecasts and financial models. Well, technically speaking, if the markets are super efficient, valuations should rise slightly by lowering the cost of capital of companies and reducing some inefficiencies, but I don't think it's all that meaningful. But I still have some hope that the SAFE Act would get better, because even though there's no provision for capital markets access, there's also no provision that prohibits it, so the language is open to interpretation. And after combing through the 30 pages of text, I found that there could be a backdoor on page 11. After comparing the 2019 version with the recently passed version, there's newly added text that says that the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network must change their guidance within 180 days of the enactment of the Safe Banking Act. Basically, FinCEN is part of the Department of Treasury, and it has a memo with a crippling anti-money laundering rule that requires banks to file suspicious activity reports for every cannabis client, even if the customer is operating in compliance with state cannabis laws. This regulation is a huge burden on banks, and many simply cannot work with them. If SAFE Act does pass, FinCEN must change this guidance, and the hope is that if it becomes less restrictive in this language, it may allow for capital markets access too. As for the current status, right now SAFE has 7 Republican senators as co-sponsors, with 32 senators altogether. It's ready to move on as long as the Senate tables a bill, but this could prove difficult, as Senate Banking Chair Sherrod Brown, who is a Democrat, has said he wants social justice provisions added on, which could ultimately reduce the appeal to Republicans. Now we just got to the most important part of the episode. What are the paths to passing these cannabis bills? Before we move on, and if you made it this far, I would super appreciate it if you smash that like and subscribe button to help me grow this channel. Anyways, the short answer to the question is that the road is unfortunately still very long, because despite Democrats are in control of both chambers, the margin in the Senate is way too thin for anything substantive to happen through normal methods of legislation. And because of the filibuster rule, passing most bills requires 60 votes from the 100 senators, and finding the 10 votes from Republican senators has proven to be a very tough job thus far. Of the 3 bills, I do think the SAFE Banking Act is likely to pass, because there are already 7 Republicans who co-sponsored the bill in the Senate. Getting 3 more for a relatively mild bill should not be that hard, but it simply won't happen anytime soon, as the Senate Banking Chairman, who is a Democrat, became a new obstacle, as he wants to add new social equity provisions to it. This might reduce some Republican support and increase the back and forths. In the chart here, the left side are a list of Republican senators who have previously co-sponsored less controversial cannabis-related bills, such as SAFE or STATES Act, so they have shown their support through real action. The list on the right are senators who I've identified could potentially be favorable to cannabis, but this is with much less certainty. These senators have simply said publicly, one way or another, that either they do not outright oppose cannabis legalization or support the idea that states should make their own decisions. Note that these 7 Republican senators that I've identified cannot be depended on if there was a vote on the MORE Act, since it is so much more comprehensive and hence is a whole other ballgame. And don't forget that there are also moderates within Democrats too, and some of them are on the fence. So right now, it's safe to say that finding 60 votes to pass anything more significant than the SAFE Banking Act is very hard. So this leads to my next question. If 10 Republican senator votes cannot be found, what are the remaining paths forward? Well, the first is to kill the filibuster rule. And unfortunately, this seems unlikely since members of Democrats' own party, Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, are opposed to it. The second method is through an obscure backdoor that is quite convoluted, so stick with me on this one. It is known as passing the bill through reconciliation by revising the budget resolution. What it does is that it attaches a cannabis bill or language to a much broader bill. In this case, it has to be the annual government budget, as it can be argued that relaxing cannabis laws can help raise revenue for the government through increasing taxes and potentially reconciliating the budget deficit. The kicker here is that bills passed through reconciliations only require a simple majority, i.e. 51 votes to pass, rather than the 60 supermajority votes required normally. Usually, Congress is only given 1 reconciliation per fiscal year, and the one this year was technically used up to approve Biden's American Rescue Plan. For that, 50 Democrats were able to approve the $1.9 trillion package as part of the fiscal year 2021 budget bill, even though no Republicans backed it. The key to making this work is to argue effectively that the new cannabis regulations can significantly affect government revenues. And the person who decides whether it does that or not is the parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough, a nonpartisan member and advisor to the Senate. McDonough has recently ruled that the Senate can revise the fiscal year 2021 budget and add new rules to it. So if Democrats do want to utilize this credit, they have until the end of fiscal year 2021 to do it, which is on September 30th. Now the third and fourth remaining paths require some concessions. The third is to go with what is most likely at this time, which is the SAFE Banking Act, and try to improve on it by adding new language to it, such as capital markets access. The last path is a controversial one, and that's to do nothing, And so Democrats can use the lack of action or obstruction by Republicans as a way to campaign for more seats in Congress during the midterm elections, which, if successful, pave the path to pass more aggressive bills in the second half of the Biden administration. So, what are my base case assumptions moving forward? Well, first of all, I do not expect the SAFE Banking Act to proceed through the Senate within the next 3 months, even though there are likely enough votes for it. Instead, I think the Senate should and will try to make progress on a more meaningful bill first, such as a modified version of the States Act. Judging by his latest tweets and interviews, I expect Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to unveil a fairly aggressive cannabis plan soon. This could provide a short-term boost to the share price. My guess is that it'll be something in between the States Act and the MORE Act. It is a risk for Democrats to let Republicans just pass a trivial bill like the SAFE Banking Act, as this could undermine the ability to pass a more significant bill in the future, while Republicans would be able to argue that they've done something for the cannabis industry during the midterm elections. Schumer may attempt to pass a more significant bill via reconciliation, and the deadline to revise the fiscal year 21 budget resolution is September 30th. This could potentially mean that there will be elevated news flow in the next couple of months for the sector. Now, some people have been messaging me and asking why the cannabis sector is trending down despite so many so-called positive news. The answer is that there really hasn't been any new unexpected news. For instance, the SAFE Banking Act that was just passed was well expected by the market, as it was the fourth time that it was passed. Other examples of, in my opinion, that are just noise is, for example, all of the talks about Schumer saying he's supportive and that he'll get things done. It doesn't matter what he says because ultimately he has to prove that the voting numbers add up. And as it stands, it does not. There's also a lot of headlines that tout safe banking's clear bipartisan support. But it is important to remember that bipartisan support with the SAFE Act does not translate to bipartisan support of more important regulations, such as the States or the MORE Act. There's recently some news that suggests Biden is also turning its back on the cannabis industry. But ultimately, what he thinks doesn't actually matter. Biden will not veto the bill with such big Democratic support once it reaches his desk. Instead, I'll give you 6 catalysts that will definitely make cannabis stocks jump if they do happen. 1. If more Republican senators voice support for a bill like the MORE or States Act. 2. If Schumer unveils a bill that is moderately ambitious and seemingly has a realistic chance to move forward, perhaps something more like a States Act than the MORE Act. This is the Goldilocks scenario. Number 3, if language in the SAFE Act is modified to explicitly include access to the capital markets. 4, if the SAFE Act passes Senate with stronger than expected bipartisan support, and FinCEN broadens its guidance to potentially allow for capital markets access. 5, if Congress revises the fiscal year 21 budget resolution to include new reconciliation instructions related to cannabis. And 6, if Senators Joe Manchin and or Kyrsten Sinema changes their tone on the filibuster rule, increasing the chance of it being eliminated by the Democrats. To sum up the key points in this episode, I hope it is clear that cannabis legalization is a matter of when and not if. But the current makeup of the Democrat-controlled chambers does not mean it will happen anytime soon. The SAFE Banking Act is a fallback plan and is not a focus for the Senate in the near term. I expect Senate Democrats to attempt a bill that is much more meaningful but tougher to pass first. Schumer technically has a September 30th deadline to revise the fiscal year 2021 budget in order to get a new legislation in through reconciliation. It's probably a good time to accumulate cannabis stocks now because of the recent pullback and increased sector news flow in the next 6 months. But remember that stocks only react if there are surprises to what the market already expects. beware of the plenty of noise in the industry that has little consequence to share prices. So that's it for this episode. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, all I ask is that you like the video, leave a comment below, and hit the subscribe button. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.